Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the second Sunday in Lent, which this year falls on March 13th. We do have one content notification for this episode. We talk about caregiving, infertility, and medical racism and misogynoir when discussing the deep dive.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For this episode, we are deep diving into caregiving and infertility, which comes up a couple times and is something that is either never talked about or kind of talked about or
really badly talked about.
Yep. So we wanted to take some time to dive into that.
So first, we'd like to talk about how parenting is a calling. It's a vocation. It's a way to live out your faith in the world. It's an incredibly important and difficult job, and that means that not everyone should do it. Just like there are some people who are not meant to be rocket scientists, there are also some people who are not meant to be parents, generally for different reasons, in my experience. But I suppose there could be somewhere that overlaps. I don't know.
Yeah.
But we do have some examples of good and problematic parenting from, say, various fandoms. The first parent who immediately came to my mind, possibly partly because of a conversation Emily and I had literally just had, was Lorelai Gilmore. I definitely watched the Gilmore Girls in high school with my mom, and it was very formative, especially the first couple of seasons for us.
One of the things that I think was especially like points to this is Lorelai goes into the high school to presumably to talk about like being a businesswoman and running the hotel and that sort of a thing. And then all of the students are like asking her questions about what it was like to be a single teen mom and if she regretted it and that sort of a thing. And so then she's talking about like the gift that it is and the actual like appreciation that she has for being Rory's mom and the way her life took shape. And then everybody's like, and then like she gets in trouble with all of the kids' parents because they're like, you're advocating single parent, like teen parenthood. And she's like, that's not what I was doing. But
no, I have especially appreciated that there's an ongoing thing throughout the show where Rory realizes that she's turning into her mom, and Lorelai realizes that in some ways she's turning into her mom. And neither of those things is always a bad thing. Like, there are moments when they're all freaked out about it in various ways, and that's fair. But also, like, they appreciate what they've gotten from each other. And I really loved watching that.
Yeah. And I was thinking about Emily Gilmore, Lorelai's mom, in a not ideal sense. And I think we could go for Christopher is a pretty bad dad.
Oh, gracious. He was a mess.
Really not present in Rory's life for most of it, and then works on sabotaging Lorelai's relationships, and
and just not at all reliable.
Yeah.
And Emily, like, she has her issues, but also she has her good points, and she's extremely consistent with Rory. So it's
she is really great at caregiving when it comes to Rory. Not like 100%, but
there are still some issues there, but like know that she genuinely cares. And even with Lorelai, you can tell that she cares. It's just she's acting it out in ways that are not the greatest.
Yeah. She and Richard are both better grandparents than they are parents.
And there are people like that. Absolutely. Yeah.
But they're not the worst parents either.
No, not by any means. And speaking of being good parents, Molly Weasley and Arthur Weasley are both very good examples of being parents. They both care deeply about their kids. They will go to a lot of trouble to make sure that their kids have what they need. Molly will totally, unofficially, semi-adopt complete strangers who need feeding up at the drop of a hat. And they're very nurturing and caring. And yes, Molly definitely has some issues, especially later on when she's realizing that her kids are growing up and she's not quite ready for that.
Especially when they're growing up in the middle of a war where they're likely to die. Like,
well, and she lost her own brothers to a war before that, and so you kind of understand where some of that comes from, but she's got her But Arthur is also shown as a very active and involved dad, and I don't think we get that often enough in fandom or in fiction in general.
Well, so in the like Molly and Arthur space. I actually was going to say one of the things that I love, and you briefly mentioned this, but it also ties back in with Lorelai, is the space to be a caregiver to children who you did not give birth to, you did not adopt, you did not provide foster care for, right? So a lot of the times that's your kids' friends or
Sure.
neighbor kids. But Lorelai does this really well for Lane.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that was lovely.
to the extent that then when Lane is like pregnant and going to have kids, she asks Rory and says, "Will you be my Lorelai?"
Yeah,
Because Lorelai was a space where Lane could listen to whatever music she wanted and that sort of a thing. And so then Lane wants Rory to be the space where like her kids can read Bibles if they need to,
sure.
right? But that, and I think Molly and Arthur do that fairly well, not in the same way that
Yeah.
not in a Lorelai Gilmore kind of way, but definitely do that for Harry and also Hermione.
Yeah, and neither of them would have adapted to the wizarding world nearly as well if it weren't for the Weasleys.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Another example of a very involved and active dad is Captain Ben Sisko from Deep Space Nine of Star Trek. He is a single dad of a teenage son. He is also a very actively involved black dad. And he has the trouble of trying to both command a space station and parenting his kid at the same time, sometimes during emergencies. And he does a lovely balancing act of that. And they did some really nice episodes addressing that too.
Yeah. I think for me in the realm of like Doctor Who, I think
Mhm.
Amy Pond and Amy and Rory Pond both, but especially
Yes.
Amy Pond is a fascinating example of caregiving because the like circumstances around which her kid was born are like all sorts of confusing and I don't know that I even understand it. But she didn't get
I'm
to,
not
and
sure
then
the writers understood it, to be fair.
right, right, which is like a theme that will come up in this episode multiple times.
Yeah.
But so she doesn't really get to raise her kid, who she names Melody,
Mhm.
the way that she might have wanted.
Right.
Right? Like she doesn't raise her as a parent raising a child, but she does get to raise her as a friend because they grow up
Yes.
together because Melody is a time
Time travel.
is a time lady.
Yeah.
And so there's just like a different way of caregiving that's like not typical and not what we would necessarily call caregiving necessarily, but it
Yeah.
is a like
Absolutely.
fun fan alternative.
Yeah. There is a series of novels called the Young Wizard series by Diane Duane. And in that, the main character's name is Juanita. And her mom is an especially interesting character because she's very in the background for the first few books. But then partway through the series, she starts coming out to play more, I guess. She gets to be a bigger character. And then there's the book where they find out that she's been diagnosed with cancer. And Juanita is a wizard. Juanita has incredibly powerful abilities. Juanita tries to cure her mom's cancer with her abilities. And that part of the book is handled gorgeously and very empathically. It's one of those things where you can really tell that the author actually spent several years as a nurse. Not
Mm,
because it's really technical, but because she understands the hell that the family goes through in a
yeah.
very deep way. And in the end, her mom gets to make her own decision about what's going to happen next. And she gets to say, "No, I'm your mom. You're not my mom.
Mm,
I'm going to take care of you." And it's one of my favorite moments in like all of literature,
cool.
let alone just young adult novels.
Yeah.
So I really love them. Also, they're on sale on Diane Duane's ebook store for half off during the pandemic. So as long as the pandemic lasts, you can get the entire series for pretty cheap. And there's
So
like
for the
11
rest of
books
our
now.
lives?
Well, we'll see. But she does actually have regular sales, and the books have been re-edited since they were originally published, and they are wonderful. So
Nice.
I definitely suggest them.
Nice. That reminded me of One Day at a Time, which is a lovely
Oh,
TV
the new
show.
version,
The
right?
new
I'm
version.
guessing.
I know the
Yes,
new version
yes,
that was
Netflix.
on Netflix, and I haven't seen the fourth. I think there's a fourth season,
Yes,
but
I
I
have not seen the pandemic season.
don't know
I
where.
think I saw the first three.
Yeah, I don't know where the fourth season came out. It was not on Netflix because Netflix does this like, we'll give you 3 seasons and then nothing
And
more,
then destroy you. Yeah,
especially for series that star people of color. But that's a
yeah.
lovely like part biological family, part chosen family of
Yes.
like clearly mom and grandma are mom and
Oh,
abuela
yeah.
are the ones who are the caregivers, but then there's like a couple other people who like kind of caregive, kind of friends, kind of kids, like
Yeah.
combo, but
And also you get Rita Moreno, which, like, seriously,
yeah,
just show up for
yes.
her alone if no one else.
And it was one of the first shows to have a non-binary character.
Yes, they did a lovely job with that,
So
for the
that
most
was
part.
good. Yeah. I also really like in the Cinder series, which is the series is kind of like alludes to different fairy tales. So Cinder alludes to
Sure.
Cinderella, right? And we know that Cinderella's stepmom is terrible as far as caregivers go.
Oh, yeah, in all the adaptations.
Yes.
Actually, now I kind of want an adaptation of Cinderella where the stepmom is awesome and the dad sucked. But
Right? Because
that
we
could be
don't
interesting.
really get that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Cinder, the first of the, I guess they're called the Lunar Chronicles
Okay.
series, but Cinder is the first one. And her adopted dad, Lynn Guerin, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, was a really caring dad and took care of her. But her stepmom, Audrey, was not. Granted, there was like particular motivation that Lynn Guerin had to take care of her because she was the well hidden princess slash heir to the lunar throne, and so that's like, you know, kind of a big deal
Probably.
when the current ruler is like trying to destroy Earth. But yeah, he cared for her, and she's a cyborg. She's like part human, part mechanical
Okay.
because of damage done in a fire. And so he cared for her and didn't discriminate, didn't have prejudice against her, whereas a lot of other
Sure.
people did. But it's a cute. I haven't read those books in a really long time, in fact. And then, of course, The French Prince of Bel Air. Because it alludes to some of the complicated nature of parenting and caregiving and raising
Yeah.
children, right? Like, even just in the intro song, I got in one
Yeah.
little fight and my mom got scared. She said, "You're moving with your auntie and uncle in Bel Air," right? She is a mom who is in a situation where she doesn't have a guaranteed way to keep her kids safe.
Yeah.
And so she sends him to live with cousins and aunt and uncle who are massively wealthy.
Handy to have those people in your life. Just saying.
Mm-hmm. 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 But also they really, for all the quirks and ups and downs and stuff, they really care about Will, and it's lovely to see like the joys, the conflict, all of that stuff that's like
Oh, yeah.
handled in a way that's not toxic and terrible.
Yeah. And of course, for those of you who aren't into all of the various Spanish things that we're into, there are plenty of parenting examples in the Bible, a lot of which
Truth.
are less than ideal.
Also truth. The first one that came to mind for me as like who's a bad parent and who's a good parent is from the two women who Solomon, in his wisdom, is like deciding between them. And one woman has stolen the other woman's kid. And so now there's a dispute between them of who gets to keep the kid. And Solomon is like, well, I'll just cut the kid in half and you can both have it. And the woman whose kid it was not is like, okay. And the woman whose kid it was is like, no, 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 she can have it. I'd rather that than the kid literally die.
Yeah.
And that's like supposedly how Solomon figures out, okay, you're the real parent. She's not.
Yeah.
And the one who was like willing to give up custody for the life of the kid is the one who gets it. So that is like,
Which, like, as far as parenting qualities goes, that's not terrible. Sure.
yeah, that's
Also, hope
good.
there's some other things going on there, but yeah.
You know, yeah.
Also, speaking of this particular Bible story, please hang out and join us all the way to the end of the episode when we will be introducing a new feature
Ooh.
for our episodes, where we will talk about Let's Make a Muppets Musical. And we're going to cast this scene with Muppets, or rather, we're going to allow someone else to cast it for us because they tweeted the idea and I think it's wonderful. And
Yeah.
so we're going to talk about that later.
Yes.
But join us again at the end of the episode to talk about that Bible story.
We are really excited for this new segment in our podcast.
Absolutely. It's going to be a good time.
Yeah.
But going back to biblical parents, speaking of Solomon having weird ideas of how to determine parenthood, Solomon himself was not really the greatest dad. His kids had some issues, and it's
Mhm.
implied pretty heavily that he didn't pay a lot of attention to them. And while we're at it, David, Solomon's dad,
Also not so great.
even more issues, if that's possible, and also had some pretty screwed up ideas about what was important with his children. And so yeah, I kind of get where Solomon thinking that that whole thing was super wise comes from, because he had some pretty weird ideas about parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Whereas, David's dad seemed to be, I don't know, pretty inoffensive. Like, Jesse had several children. All of them contributed to the family. David
Mm-hmm.
was off herding the sheep, and Jesse didn't really seem to think it was likely that he would wind up being a king, but that doesn't mean Jesse didn't care about him, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't seem to say that in an especially insulting way, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Like,
You got to pick one to stay back with the sheep.
yeah, and being surprised that it's his youngest son that would be picked to be king of Israel is not unusual for that culture. That's
Mm-hmm.
fair.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I was thinking even further back in the
yes.
Bible that Sarah had some issues
Oh,
around
yeah.
parenthood and caregiving, especially because Hagar, who really was a great mom and took really good care of Ishmael in really bad situations and
Yeah.
circumstances, but because of the way that slavery and
Yeah.
birth and all of those things worked,
And Sarah's own ideas worked out.
and Sarah's own ideas, right? Sarah like gives Hagar to Abraham, and Hagar
Ew.
gets pregnant, and technically the kid is like Sarah's, but really Hagar's. And then Sarah gets jealous and doesn't like the kid. And then, especially after she has Isaac, really doesn't like Ishmael and kicks him out. And she's supposed to be
Yeah.
responsible for caring for Ishmael and Isaac. And Abraham is like pretty crappy in there, in that he just kind of like
In
does whatever
so many
Sarah
ways.
wants. It's
He's
like,
also
okay,
not the world's greatest husband, but we don't have to go into that
yeah,
right now.
there's which, like, you can be a really good parent and not a really good spouse, and you can be a really good spouse and not a good parent, but it's
Yeah.
hard.
Both. Both are hard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard. It's hard to be good at caregiving if you're not a good spouse,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then, a little bit down the line is the like Jacob, Rachel, Leah love triangle becomes family. Add in Bilhah and Zilpah, the concubines, the enslaved women,
And then Rachel dies
and
young,
Rachel dies
and
young. And
all of the children have different statuses.
yep, and the space where parenting really comes to a forefront of like, this is not a great example of parenting, is Joseph is so clearly the favorite.
Yeah.
Like, there are things that Joseph does and truths that Joseph tells that does not endear Joseph to their brothers.
Yeah,
But
Joseph is kind of a little snot here and there, but
yeah,
yeah.
but Jacob really doesn't help the situation by like playing favorites to such an extent that it causes
Yeah, you don't need to encourage that crap. No.
discontent amongst the brothers and that sort of thing. And there are multiple
I
ways
mean,
to read that
still,
story.
yeah, also don't throw your brother in the well no matter how irritating your dad is about him. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
siblings
totally
should
fair.
not be
But
killed
yeah,
and should not be thrown in wells. I
and
feel
shouldn't
like
be blamed for the parents' behavior.
Yeah, I feel
But
like this is usually just a K statement, but I'm taking it on this
murder is
way.
still bad, folks. You heard it here
Indeed.
first.
One of my favorite examples, though, is Hannah, who is Samuel's
Yes.
mother. So in First Samuel, and she struggles a lot with infertility and an inability to have a kid. And
Yeah.
she prays about it, and she prays and prays and prays to the point where Eli the priest thinks she's drunk because she's praying so hard. She gets scorned by her husband's other wife or
I think it's
concubine.
one wife. No, he definitely has more than one wife,
Yeah.
but he is also, his name is Elkanah, and he's also said to love her dearly despite the fact that she hasn't had a child.
Yes, Elkanah for
She's still his
sure
favorite.
loves Hannah.
Yeah.
But Elkanah's other wife definitely like makes fun of and
Is
like
less than
really,
charitable. Yes.
really is cruel to Hannah about her not having a kid. So then she finally does have a kid, and she has promised to dedicate the child to God. And so Samuel doesn't necessarily grow up with her, but she takes care of him. She provides clothing
Yeah.
for him every year. She visits him. She's not throwing him out into the streets like he is raised by
No.
Eli. But yeah, she just like there's such a
And then
clear
she has
calling.
additional children.
Yeah, there's such a clear calling for her to be a parent. And then she actually gives care to the kids.
Yeah. One of my favorite examples is actually the Syrophoenician woman, or
Mm-hmm.
depending on which gospel reading you read, she might be the Canaanite woman. She comes to Jesus asking him to heal her child, and Jesus insults her, and she
Mm-hmm.
just breezes right through it and keeps insisting that he needs to heal her child. And there is sort of an interesting way of flipping this Bible story into a fanish reference, because it's not exactly like she's Molly Weasley saying, "Not my daughter."
Mm-hmm.
It's more like she's saying, "You're not going to not heal my daughter. Like, I'm not putting up with this.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to heal her." But I really appreciate her stubbornness.
Yes, she is stubborn and she has a way with words.
And she will do whatever it takes, including taking insults from some random rabbi, if that means that her child is healed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of different people throughout the Bible, from widows to random parents, that come to
Yeah,
Jesus for healing. So the
sure.
man in the second half of the Transfiguration Gospel that we read, also known as Idris Elba in Let's Make a Muppets musical, according to our Transfiguration guest Emily Ann Garcia. But
Yes.
that man coming and trying to get help for his kid, and then persisting when those he went to, the disciples that were still down on the mountain, can't help him, persisting
Yes.
until he does get the help his kid needs.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. And then one of the ones that I think is a kind of great juxtaposition and a good segue into our next one. Look at this. I'm transitioning it well.
Yes.
Is
We're
the
all very proud.
is the story of the Roman centurion with the 12-year-old girl who is dying, who is sick and probably dying. And that is a sandwich story. So it takes place and in the middle of it is another story. In the middle of the story of the Roman centurion. And that story is about a woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years. I didn't know that there were people who didn't realize that hemorrhaging means like menstruating, bleeding, unable
Yeah.
to have kids for 12 years, and thought that like she
Yeah.
would be like hemorrhaging blood from somewhere else. Didn't realize that people thought that, but like when we talk about her, it is very much related to ability to give birth and
Yeah, she very likely has
gynecological
fibroids or something.
stuff.
Yeah.
But I love that combination of like this person who is like caring deeply for this child, and this person who presumably doesn't have children, and is doing her best and at her wit's end in caring for herself. And
Yeah.
both of those are really
Absolutely.
important.
Yeah, so related to that, there are a lot of people out there who, for whatever reason, cannot have kids. And as it turns out, there are a lot of reasons why people don't or can't have children.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the reasons are financial. If you're not in a financially stable position, choosing to not have kids can be the responsible choice.
Mm-hmm. And
Absolutely.
it's just like a logistical
Nightmare.
nightmare. Yeah.
Childcare in America. Oh my goodness.
I
Put
mean,
yourself into debt before your kid even goes to college.
I think in New
Like,
York
yeah.
it's harder to get into a daycare. I don't know if it still is, but for a while it was harder to get into a daycare in New York City than Harvard.
Yeah, I would not be at all surprised. Yep.
Yeah. So it's not even just like once we've saved a little more, we'll have a kid. It's like
It's
completely
amazing.
out of the
And
realm of
also,
possibility.
then you add on the costs of like general health care, and
Mm-hmm.
a 5-year-old is very likely to break a bone of some kind because they're 5-year-olds and
Mm-hmm.
they throw themselves around a lot. And so there's going to be all kinds of healthcare costs too. And that's on top of feeding and clothing a small person who is constantly outgrowing their clothes. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. And there's additional costs for folks in relationships that don't follow the cis heteronormative
Yeah.
pattern. So there are costs of getting pregnant, and that frequently looks a lot like fertility processes. But I know people who have been single and getting pregnant on their own as queer people,
Sure.
as not queer people, but also queer couples where they don't automatically have sperm, egg, and uterus in
Yeah.
their family system to be able to just make a baby, even on accident.
Yeah.
And so that makes a big difference of like how much not all health insurance covers it and
Yeah.
how much extra cost you need, and to make sure you find somebody who's queer competent, especially if
Yeah.
it's someone who's trans, who's the one who's going to be carrying the baby, like, or if there's
Yeah.
surrogacy. There's just so much that is complicated.
Speaking of healthcare issues.
Yeah.
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 There's also a bunch of medical issues that might be involved that might not be related to fertility at all. If someone in the family who wants to be a parent also has some kind of disability, which might include invisible disabilities, it might not even be a physical disability. There are mental conditions that affect your life strongly enough that it does impact your ability to care for a child, particularly newborns or toddlers.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who have backgrounds that mean that they have some stuff to work through before they're going to be able to parent a child. And there are also medical conditions that you wouldn't initially think might affect someone's ability to parent a child, but like when you think about it, people who have chronic fatigue, people who have really terrible backs and can't lift heavy things, people who get sick more easily than other folks, all of those things impact your ability to parent a child, especially because children are petri dishes and will bring home every bug in the neighborhood
Yeah.
all the time.
Which,
So
to be perfectly clear, we are not saying that if you have any, if like any of that is in your realm of experience, you shouldn't be a parent. It's
no,
just
you
that like
absolutely
there are
can be,
people
but
who
only if you know that you
choose
can be.
not to, right? Like that
Yeah,
recognize those as barriers in a way that is prohibitive of them having a kid or raising
yeah.
a kid. And it is not for any of us who are not them to tell them they shouldn't have a kid. That is not what we're
Oh,
saying.
gracious, no.
Just doing the like increased awareness and understanding of why people
Absolutely.
might choose not to or might not be able to.
1000%. Yeah.
And there's also actual fertility issues, right?
Yeah, just in case there weren't enough problems already.
Amazing. And fertility is something that I think I have heard most acutely cisgender women talk about, but it is something that
Yeah,
everybody can experience. There are fertility issues for people with penises who produce
yeah,
sperm. There are fertility issues with people with uteruses and ovaries who produce eggs. There are fertility issues for people who are intersex and maybe have both or neither or some combination that is unclear.
yeah,
There are a lot of fertility issues. Also, not any of your business. And there's also the fertility issues caused by racism and medical racism in particular.
oh, gracious, yeah.
I think it was just last year that, I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, that we heard about women, particularly cisgender women, who were in detention centers who were given hysterectomies in the US without knowledge or consent. There's a
Yeah,
long history of making Black women infertile.
yes,
While there's also the racist trope of Black women being extra fertile.
yes.
Right.
If you really want to horrify yourself and explore the depths that humanity is capable of, look into the history of gynecology. Also, be ready for nightmares, like literal, actual nightmares.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know somebody who, like, specifically, one of their elders said to them, if a doctor tells you you need a hysterectomy, say no, because
Yeah,
that will be the first option that a doctor goes for you because you are a Black woman.
yeah.
Yeah. It's bad.
Whereas other women who actually want hysterectomies can't get them for literal blood or money, but that's a
Right.
separate
Because
podcast
they
episode.
might want to have a kid later. Yeah.
Or their imaginary husband who doesn't exist yet might want them to have a kid later because who cares about their consent? Yeah.
Yeah.
Different deep dive, different
But
podcast episode. Moving on.
speaking of imaginary husbands,
Oh,
relationship
gracious.
status is also a reason that makes it hard for people to have kids. There are a lot of people I
Yes.
know who were waiting until the right person came along so that they could
Sure.
have a family and they could like follow the, cis heteronormative pattern of a dad and a mom giving birth to a kid.
Sure.
And that has been so fed into people that that is the appropriate route, that then by the time they
They
accept
realize
that
it's not going to happen.
it's not going to happen that way, they might not be able to have a kid anymore. But I
Yeah.
also know people who have fostered or adopted as single parents, And
And
that's this
we'll get
like
into that
beautiful thing.
further in a
Yeah.
little bit. Yeah. Let's also acknowledge that being called to being a parent and being called to being a single parent, also slightly different things.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's also the difficult dynamic of the ways that sex and pregnancy and getting particularly a young teen girl to have your baby is used as power and control in relationships. And so even like it could be divorce, it could be separation. Like there are so many different reasons why you are not able to have kids or why having kids is really complicated. I mean, it is
Yeah.
complicated, period, but can be
Yeah.
especially
Absolutely.
complicated and difficult or even harmful.
There are oodles of additional reasons that we can't even begin to name because we can't imagine them. But
Mm-hmm.
your life, your housing, your it's possible your dietary needs are
Mm-hmm.
involved in this because if you have to spend so much time cooking for yourself that you wouldn't be able to care for a child, that is a whole
Yeah.
separate thing.
Or like the amount of
So
stress that
lots of
you're
different.
under, like
Yeah.
that can
Do
keep
you have a
you.
job that allows you to get time off?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a whole thousands of different things that
Mm-hmm.
play into that. And so we need to remember to make room for people who might want to be parents but can't be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also, while we're making room for people who are different from us, we need to remember that not all caregivers are necessarily the biological parents of a
Mm-hmm.
particular child.
Yeah. There are lots of ways to be a caregiver in addition to being a biological parent. Some of the most common that we talk about or throw out as options are adoption and foster care. Both of those are really complicated and really expensive. And also,
Yeah.
if you would be a good foster parent, do it. There's a
Yes.
huge lack of foster parents, especially of queer competent foster parents,
Yeah.
and an overrepresentation of queer kids in foster care. So,
And also disabled kids and
mm-hmm,
children with learning disabilities or
mm-hmm,
developmental disabilities. Yeah.
yeah, or children experiencing who have experienced significant trauma, probably have
Absolutely.
PTSD. Like it's part of how they become in foster care. But definitely do that. And it's a complicated thing, right? There's the Indian Child Welfare Act, which has been getting challenged a bunch. Also, like puts
Yeah.
parameters around who is able or not able to adopt Native children.
And there's a whole bunch of really good reasons behind that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So any sort of like when we talk about adoption and foster care, if you are considering any sort of transracial adoption or foster care, that takes significantly extra work, particularly for white people, but
Yes.
for anybody to make sure that you are understanding the culture that the kid comes from and the power dynamics and finding ways
Please talk
to,
to people who have been there.
yeah,
Please especially talk to people who were the adoptee in
yes,
those situations.
yep, yeah,
Yeah. But also there are lots of other ways that you can be a caregiver to children.
yes, there are.
You can absolutely be a caregiver to children by being a teacher in their life. There are so many people I
Mm-hmm.
know who, when they are asked to talk about the important adults in their childhoods, don't go for family members. They go for teachers
Yep,
every time.
yeah, teachers are wonderful.
Yeah,
Also, being a godparent,
absolutely.
and that can be like in an official baptismal sponsor kind of role. It can be in a if I die, my kids are my kids are coming to
Yeah,
leave with you kind of role. There are a lot of different options, but
yeah.
I know being a godparent is a special kind of bond, and especially if it is connected to baptism, like you get to have a special day where you remind the kid that they're baptized and that they are loved by God every year, and or an extra excuse to buy them gifts. Who knows?
In case you need one. Not everyone does, but
Yeah.
if you want one, sure. Also, goodness knows, being a grandparent is a wonderful way, whether or not you're the official biological grandparent,
Mm-hmm.
is a wonderful way to be a caregiver to a child. My childhood elementary school had a adopt a grandparent program for the local nursing home, and that was a lot of fun. Not entirely because we got a day off of math class and also got to go over there when there were usually also dogs visiting the residents, but it was a lot of fun because we enjoyed getting to know the adults too.
Yeah, when I was in college, there was an adopt a grandparent program that was a gift for folks in the nursing home and a gift for lonely college students who were missing their
Yes.
parents. And at camp, I worked at Rainbow Trail Lutheran Camp when I was growing up, and they had a program where there were camp grandparents, and my dad did it a couple of years, and he was a camp uncle. He would like
Yes.
he was Uncle Al, the kiddie's pal, but other people were grandparents, and they provide that comfort and care that sometimes especially homesick kids need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, now that I think about it, there was a Harry Potter fan fiction that gave Hagrid the job of the children's custodian.
Mm,
And it was his job to listen to their troubles and care about them in a loving and parental and quasi parental way. And I thought that was beautiful because I don't know that Hagrid was especially called to be a teacher, but he did a lovely job in that role.
yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And then there's also, extended family, when there are siblings, kids, or parents, siblings,
Sure.
cousins,
Semi
greats.
cousins,
Yeah, greats, all of those things.
cousins removed by whatever
Yep.
generations. Yeah.
Yeah. Depending on family structure, I know there's a lot of like holding up the nuclear family, which has been created fairly recently and is not a sustainable model for, I think, anybody.
No.
But that works. Or folks who co parent, multiple people co parenting together.
Yeah.
Um,
That is a skill
mm-hmm.
and vastly important.
Yeah. And then also your friends' kids. I have two different friends who have kids, a soon to be 2-year old and a soon to be 4-year old who I talk about with some amount of regularity.
Yeah.
And the relationship that I have with them is unique. It is not just like a kid running around, but we have a relationship and we talk and we do like video calls, and
Sure.
that's really beautiful.
Wonderful. Yeah, and for that matter, a lot of us grew up with neighborhood adults or church adults in our lives, and we can also be that neighborhood adult or that church adult in kids' lives by whether you're officially volunteering at church or officially volunteering in the neighborhood or not officially doing anything at all, but just being one of those adults who genuinely cares about the kids around you and also gets to know their parents so that their parents don't freak out.
Mm-hmm.
But like it is very possible to be that kind of adult in a kid's life, and those adults can also be life changing.
Yeah, those adults are amazing.
Yeah.
And there's, right, you can be a single parent, whether it's through
Yes.
adoption, foster care, biological,
Yeah.
divorce.
And our
Yeah.
metaphorical hats are off to single parents because my goodness, that's extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is partly because of all of these different ways to be caregivers and more that we haven't even named, but are sure to exist, that when we are talking to kids, it's important to not shrink the possibilities of who could be caring for them. I think particularly in a church
Yes.
context, if kids come up for the children's sermon or something, and then to talk about your mommies and daddies or something like that is really restrictive and can contribute to a real like erasure and confusion for kids who are not raised by a mom and a dad. And so,
Or for that matter, unfortunately, the number of pastors of a certain demographic I've known who have done those children's sermons while there was a kid sitting there who had recently had a parent die in the last year. Just like be aware, folks, please.
yeah. And there are biological parents and other caregivers who are not safe
Yeah.
and who cause harm. So also be aware if you're talking about anything about who the good people are in your life, the good grown-ups. But one thing that I like to say is when kids have come forward and then I'm like sending them back to their seats, I talk about going back to their grown-ups or their adults. But to flip it a little bit, and I think we've talked about this a little before, but to have the possession be the kids. So the relationship
Yes.
of the adult is to the kid, and it's the kid's grown up. And I think that
Yeah.
is a really great way of kind of opening the space for agency and belonging, and like,
Absolutely.
yeah.
It's child centered.
Yeah.
It's not adult centered.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
And also, I picked up a term from the corner of Twitter populated by teachers of calling those adults their raisins, as in, who's raising you? And I think that's adorable, and we should absolutely all pick it up. And it does require a little explaining sometimes, but that's okay.
Yeah,
But I love that.
I do love puns, and
Yes.
that one is like a little bit
It's a
something.
little twee, I think, but I love it anyway.
Yeah.
And We can also make an effort to welcome, both in a church community, but also in any community,
Mm-hmm.
to welcome those people who are childless or who are child free. So not everybody who doesn't have children wants kids, and that's
Mm-hmm.
okay too. And there are certain times of the year when we have to pay a little extra attention to that. Now, me personally, I have never really noticed Advent as being all about Mary's pregnancy in the churches that I have attended, because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on during Advent. Like there's all these prophecies
Mm-hmm.
and stuff, and like Herod is doing stuff in the background. And so I've never really paid that much attention to Mary's actual pregnancy during Advent, which I know sounds kind of weird to some people, but like there's a bunch of stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
But also, you don't necessarily need to make every Advent sermon about these stages of pregnancy and what is biologically going on in Mary's body, because we don't know what was going on in Mary's body or how Mary's pregnancy went. She may have been miserable being pregnant. We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Don't tell us what's not true.
Yeah. And like I am one of the people who like really wants to be pregnant during Advent, but also not going to be a mom. And Advent is
Yes.
about way more than pregnancy. Yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, going to church on Mother's Day is a real trial for a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm.
And I know plenty of people who just, if they have the option, they skip that day entirely and they do not go to church, because you never know how the church is going to handle it. And even if the clergy or leadership try to set a reasonable level of welcoming people who don't have good relationships with their moms or whatever, there can be individuals in the congregation who still say horrific things,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no protecting against that.
Yeah. And
So if you skip church on Mother's Day,
don't feel bad.
yeah,
Never feel
we
bad.
do not
Yeah.
we do not blame you at all.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And Father's Day for that matter. It's so much
absolutely.
pressure is put upon women in particular to be mothers, to the extent that
Yeah.
like sometimes those Mother's Day things, like any woman gets a rose or a flower or whatever. You don't have to be.
Well, I've seen that where they're trying to be inclusive, and I appreciate the effort, but like
Yeah,
it also doesn't always.
I
Yeah.
appreciate the like effort, but also no, because not everyone is and not everyone wants to be. And
Yeah, the best approach to that I've seen is to acknowledge that everybody probably, had a mother or a person of that type in their life, whether or not they actually got to have a relationship. Like someone did give birth to you at some point.
and I will say, like, I think even that is complicated, right? Because
Yeah,
if it's a surrogate parent or if it is someone who's trans, you might not
yeah,
actually have a mother.
right,
And so I think there are ways to acknowledge the pain and the hurt and the harm that is caused by
right.
Mother's Day and by all that is involved in social pressures and all of that stuff connected to mothers and to Father's Day for that matter. And
Sure.
my general rule is we shouldn't be celebrating secular holidays. For the most part, we should not be celebrating secular holidays in the church. And
Yes.
it's partly that Mother's Day and Father's Day are so complicated, but also as a non-binary person, there is no non-binary Parents' Day. There is no like
Also, that sounds like a terrible holiday name. Like you've got to come up with something a little.
right? Like
It's a little clinical.
there are plenty of like names that non-binary people come up with for like what they want to be called as a parent. But
Sure.
when we do things that are gendered, unless you're like real good and paying someone who is non-binary to help
Yeah.
you figure out how to make it inclusive, non-binary and like has experience helping with this, you're
Yeah.
gonna be excluding people.
Absolutely. Come to think of it, I think the one secular holiday that I would be okay with recognizing in church would be the International Cat Day. But that might be because Maggie was climbing into my lap as you were talking.
I was thinking June, like there are some that are connected to justice
Oh, sure.
that we should because justice is part of the church. But
Yeah.
yeah, don't get me wrong, I like sleeping in on New Year's Day.
Yeah. Also, like Arbor Day. Sure.
Yeah, Earth Day, Labor Day.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see a church do a good job of that. But anyway, long
I've known
story.
a couple.
Also, so many of the women in the Bible, when we pay any attention to them at all in the first place, are acknowledged less as individual people and more as someone's mom or as someone's relative or whatever, and that's not okay either. And so we have to be careful about our words regarding that too.
Yeah, and that's just like a common thing that happens, right? The number of men who are like, I didn't understand this until I had a daughter of my own. And I'm like, really?
That's
Really?
weird
So you didn't
and like
consider women
genuinely
to be
sociopathic
human
of you.
beings until
That's not a good sign, and please stop telling on yourself. No,
Yep.
actually, please keep telling on
Right.
yourself because I'm glad to know that some people are like that.
Yeah.
But like, I wish there were fewer people who had to tell on themselves that way. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then, of course, there are some things you just should not say to people. For example, don't ask if someone is pregnant. If someone is pregnant and they want you to know, they will tell you,
Mm-hmm.
usually at top volume and very excitedly.
Mm-hmm.
And let them have that moment, by all means.
Yes. Without your hands on them. Let them have that moment
Yeah,
without your hands on their stomach.
don't touch them. Yeah.
Leave their bellies alone.
You can offer to shake their hand. That's okay.
Yeah.
But offer. You don't know what's going on with their life. They might have gas that day. They might have recently gained weight, or not so recently. They might just not be wearing the same clothes that you're used to seeing them wearing, and because of their clothes they're shaped a
Mm-hmm.
little differently that day. They might have recently had a
Yeah.
miscarriage. They might be infertile. They might be struggling with that. You don't know. So don't ask if someone is pregnant
Mm-hmm.
because you might cause them serious trauma.
Yeah. Just don't ask.
Also, while we're at it, please don't tell people who have realized that they can't have children the quote unquote traditional way that they should just adopt.
Ooh.
One, adoption is complicated.
Mm-hmm. And expensive.
Two, not everybody has the resources it takes to adopt, or like they might have been adopted themselves and have some issues with that,
Mm-hmm.
or all that kind
Or
of
they
thing.
might be in an adoption process that takes forever and they don't get paid.
Yeah, they might have been in an adoption process that just got canceled the day before. Don't embarrass yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And for that matter, foster care is also incredibly complicated. Like, we love and admire foster parents, and you are wonderful, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of emotion there, and it's so hard. And so don't tell people to just do that. And also, if someone is struggling with infertility, don't assure them, don't worry, God will give you a baby someday.
That is
Because no,
not how
that might not
God
happen.
works.
Yes, also not how God works, but also like that just might not
Yeah.
happen. If they don't have a child, that doesn't mean that God doesn't love them.
Yeah. The only way to fit into God's work in the world is not having a kid. That is not the only way. There are
Yeah, that is not how that works.
many, many ways.
Absolutely. Our first reading for this episode is from Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 12 and 17 through 18. God promises Abram an heir and descendants to inherit the land of Canaan, which God will also give him.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of dreams. Most of this happens in one of Abram's dreams, and I was thinking about it, and there are dreams that happen in a lot of different fiction and sci-fi fantasy stuff, but in
Oh, yeah.
Buffy, which I've been working my way through, the dreams that Buffy has, and Faith for that matter, one of the other Slayers, are very real, just like they are for Abram. Like, they are real and they are creepy. And if you don't think that this dream is creepy, then why don't you take a minute and imagine a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch going between hunks of dead animal? Creepy. I'm just saying.
Or possibly just a slightly unusual barbecue, but yeah, sure.
I mean,
Also creepy.
also that. But,
No, it's very clearly a creepy thing, and it's described in a creepy manner in the Bible. Absolutely.
yeah. And then in verse 4, we read, "But the word of the becoming one came to Abram. This man, Eliezer, shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir." So this is talking about inheritance, right? Who is going to get the mantle that is what it means to be Abrahamic? The land, the wealth, all of those things. And I was thinking about inheritance in Marvel Cinematic Universe, and
Mhm.
it is almost never a biological child that inherits the mantle of the hero. This is like
Yeah.
clearest in Spider-Man, right? Like there are a million Spider-Men and it's a multiverse thing and they're not all
Also Batman.
men,
Yeah.
all of that. They're not all men, they're not all human, all of that.
Yeah.
But with like the one exception that I could really think of is Black Panther. But even within Black Panther, there is space for someone to challenge
Yeah.
the passing down of the mantle. And it's almost like genetic makeup or membership in a particular biological family is not a great indicator of who should possess or do something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hashtag down with the monarchy. Except we really like the queen and we're really sad that she has COVID.
Queen Elizabeth is a class act. The rest of her family gets less
Yeah.
fortunate. But
And then in verse 5, we read, God brought Abram outside and said, look towards heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And in fact, no, Abram cannot count them. No human being can count all of the stars, because even in seemingly dark spaces where it doesn't look like there are any stars, thanks to Hubble, we know that there are tons. And in fact, most of the stars that you see are actually galaxies. So it's not just one, but hundreds, if not thousands, if not more than that, even. So good luck counting all the stars.
Although I really hope that God wasn't like throwing shade at Abram's math abilities, because that seems unnecessary.
I kind of hope that God was, because later Abram proves that.
Yeah.
By only going down to 10.
I also read verse 5 and thought to myself, so God had a very specific plan for Abram and also Sarai and the rest of his family for very specific reasons in order to essentially create the Jewish people. But that doesn't mean that this is God's plan for everybody, right?
God is not a cookie cutter.
Yeah, this doesn't even mean that God has a very specific plan for everybody, or like any one particular plan for anybody, everybody. There are various places in the Bible where God claims some foreknowledge of what's going to happen in people's lives, but that's not the same thing as controlling it. And if you want an example of that, I immediately think back to the stories of Cassandra in ancient Greek myths, who was essentially cursed to know what was going to happen, but no one would ever believe her.
Oh.
Now, I also think that it's possible that she would have had some fun with that ability. And there is a cartoon that we can link to in the episode description that describes one example of how she might have had a little fun with that. But also, that must have been exhausting. And also, wonderful illustration of women not being believed by society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about Cassandra and didn't realize the part that nobody would believe her. So I was like, oh,
Right.
Bruno from Encanto. Problem with Bruno is everybody does believe him because they're true. It's true, but
Yeah.
then then a whole bunch of complicated things
I could see a
happen,
whole
and
different set of problems arising from that.
he gets blamed for them versus
But it doesn't mean that you controlled it. Yeah. And then in verse 6 we read, and when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. But they were not Klingon birds of prey, and so Abram did not need to engage warp drive. Although now I'm wondering how various biblical characters would fit into Starfleet, and I suppose if we ever get tired of casting the Muppet Bible musical, we may wind up going into casting biblical characters in our various favorite fandoms, and that could be fun.
That could be fun. Also, when you were reading Birds of Prey, I was thinking of so do they do the Iran's position with the wings flipped up or just out?
Are they a separate church from the praying mantises,
Right?
or do
Do
they
they
worship
bow
with
their
them, or do they eat
head?
the praying mantises, or the yeah, exactly. Yep.
I want to know, dear listeners, your favorite Birds of Prey. It's like
Actually, I have one. Well, I don't know that they're actually birds, but there is an artist named Ursula Vernon who has a illustration called Cardinals in Winter, and I think they are tiny little birds dressed in tiny little red robes with tiny little red staffs. They're cardinals. They're Catholic cardinals, and it's fantastic, and I want a copy of it for my office, but I've never actually managed to do that yet because I haven't been in one place long enough. So, one of these days.
Yeah,
but they're adorable.
I was gonna say Unvirtuous Abby frequently has an actual picture of the Holy Spirit doing XYZ, and it's
Yes,
always an
I love all
owl
of
or
them.
a bird of
Yes.
prey. Our second reading for this episode is Philippians chapter 3, verse 17 through chapter 4, verse 1. Paul reminds us that the world will disappoint us, but we don't have to follow the world, and God will not disappoint us. One of the themes for this passage is the idea of feasting in the face of other people's oppression or vulnerability or danger even. But the image that came to me for this was in Lord of the Rings Return of the King, when Pippin has just been installed in service in Gondor to the steward of Gondor, Denethor, and it is Faramir's near-death scene. And so we get this beautiful, cinematically beautiful and just gut-wrenching juxtaposition of Billy Boyd singing the most gorgeous song ever, Denethor eating and splurting tomato down his like chin, and
Yes.
Faramir and the other soldiers riding off to almost certain death.
Yeah.
All because his dad loved his brother more.
And had some fairly serious mental health
Yeah.
issues on top
But
of that.
speaking
Yeah.
of
Which,
people who are maybe not called to be parents, Denethor
yes,
of Gondor.
absolutely. And then in verse 17, we read, "Brothers and sisters, and all siblings, one would hope, join in imitating me and observe those who live according to the example you have in us." Again, I do feel like I need to point out that this is still very early days for the church. There are not that many Christians, like especially relative to how many Christians there are in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
And there were even fewer well known Christians. And so when Paul tells people to imitate him, he's one of only a few role models they really had for what being a Christian meant.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's not quite being like Zap Brannigan from Futurama and being super conceited. He might still be being a little conceited. It's a little hard for us to tell because, culture clash and we're not there and we don't really know his relationship with these people. So, like, a little conceited is probably an option, but also it's hard to tell. But he's not like, this is not Joel Osteen.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. And then in the following verse 18, we read, "For many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. I have often told you of them, and now I tell you even with tears." So, if the cross of Christ is the ultimate symbol of God's self sacrificing, all encompassing love for us, which we are told many, many, many times in the Bible
Mm-hmm.
that it is, uh, then the enemies of that cross would, I suppose, be those who are selfish and prejudiced, whose love is limited by conditions. And so that makes me think of, say, people who make a living off of creating bigoted legislation.
Mm.
They seem like a candidate for that. I'm just
Yeah.
saying. Also, that's not just limited to politicians. There's a lot of people involved in that industry, and yes, it is an industry.
Yeah.
So,
Also, I was thinking about like the number of politicians who have stocks and can buy
yeah,
stocks when they know something is going to
terrifying.
happen before the rest of us,
Or sell them.
or sell
Yep.
them. Yep. Yeah. It's like capitalism is corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And then in verse 20, we read, "But our citizenship is in heaven, and it is from there that we are expecting a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ." This whole sentence, and in fact, most of what Paul writes, is anti empire. Paul is specifically pushing against the idea of Roman citizenship, of Caesar as Lord. So that would be also pushing against United States citizenship, pushing against the idea of
Yeah.
any one president as the savior, as the one who will do all the things that need to be done.
Yeah. Or for that matter, any one person.
Right.
Like, don't put your hopes in human beings because that's going to go
Yep.
badly.
Yeah. And that, like, then you make it so that only one person, that, like, nobody can ever change anything because they have to be able to do everything. It does not work. Movements are not
Yeah.
built on one person. Even
No.
God is a trinity.
I feel like that needs to be a bumper sticker, but it would probably also need to be unpacked a little more.
Yeah. Just a little. But yeah, it's a bit like The Expanse TV series that just concluded. But there's like, well, the inners and the belters. So that's Mars and Earth are both inners, but they're also like against each other and against the belters, which is the asteroid folks who live in the asteroid belt. But really, like, you slowly get the idea of like it's more complicated, and
Yes.
really, like, everybody belongs to humanity. And I know it's really schmaltzy, but I do
Yeah.
love that, like, pushback of it is not about which nation you pledge allegiance to. That is not how it works, and that is
No.
not what God is about. And then in verse 21, we read, "Christ will transform the body of our humiliation so that it may be conformed to the body of Jesus' glory, by the power that also enables Jesus to make all things subject to Jesus' self." And this actually, speaking of certain legislatures, certain elected officials, I should say, this actually really made me think about transgender people, trans people who choose and or need to physically transition in some form. So that could be through
Sure.
hormones and or surgery. And that, like, that idea of the transformation of the body of our humiliation to be conformed to the body of Jesus' glory, and the ways that gender confirming surgeries and or hormones can be a beautiful transformation to what is more
Absolutely.
in line with who God calls us to be. So
And of course, in fantasy universes, they also have magical means available to them sometimes.
It
So,
is true. So mostly it's a yay trans people. Also, the very clear disclaimer, as someone for whom this is true, that not all trans people do this. Not all trans people
yeah,
take particular hormones or have particular
yeah.
surgeries in order to change their body.
And then our gospel reading for this episode is Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. Pharisees warn Jesus that Herod wants to kill him, and Jesus responds that he must die in Jerusalem, no matter how much he wants to turn into a chicken. We promise that makes sense if you actually read the reading.
I love that.
It really does sound like he wants to turn into a chicken. I'm on board with
Oh.
that part. Yeah.
So, one of the themes in this passage is the idea of impending doom. The Pharisees in this case are warning Jesus about the impending doom of Herod. And it reminded me, this happens in a lot of like actiony fantasy stuff, fiction stuff. But in Mockingjay, the third Hunger Games book,
Mhm.
and I think the fourth movie, in the sewer tunnels when they're trying to go assassinate President Snow, at one point there's like these creatures that are trying to attack them, and then Finnick Odair jumps into the fray and says, "Go, go, go," as in like, get out of here while I fight them off, and then ends up dying. And it frequently that's how it works, right? Like, go, 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 I'll hold them back. Go, 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 I'll fight them off. Go, 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 Herod's
Yeah.
going to try and kill you. You know, like
Sure.
you do.
And then in verse 32, we read, Jesus said to them, Go and tell that fox for me, Listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. So basically, I read this as Jesus saying, I am too busy for your crap right now, Herod. I do not have time for this. And it reminds me of there's a bit near the start of the movie The Terminal that came out in 2004,
Mm-hmm.
which feels like it was a long time ago, and that bothers me,
Oh,
but that's a whole separate conversation about aging.
yeah.
When Victor meets the janitor, whose first name is Gupta, but we don't know that at the time, and they later become friends. But the first time that they meet, Gupta, the janitor, tells him that he doesn't have time for Victor right now. He should come back on Tuesday. Tuesday? Tuesday.
Hmm.
And that becomes a thing. So
I feel like I saw that movie, but maybe I just saw the previews a bunch. It's the one where Tom Hanks is like stuck in the.
it's stuck in the airport.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
It was interesting. It is definitely not the worst movie I've ever seen. It is it was they were trying to do a particular thing. They did it. There could have been a few more, things going on there, but it was a thing that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Spielberg, it was not my favorite.
That's fair. Also, the 2-year-old in my life loves foxes right now, so I just have like a special place in my heart.
Maybe don't use that metaphor with the 2-year-old. That would get across a little differently. Don't have a 2-year-old that you have inspired to name their favorite stuffed fox Herod. That would probably take a little explaining to people.
Yeah, the fox is named Snuggles. Snuggles the fox. Snuggles the
Oh,
fox.
that's much better. Yes,
Who also
absolutely.
is like a snuggle comfort item. That particular fox. There are many. But.
I'm sure.
And then in verse 33, Jesus continues, Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day, I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed away from Jerusalem. This feels like a pretty flimsy plot device / narrative causality. Thank you very much. Can't be killed away from Jerusalem, so I guess I'm safe until I get there. Come on.
Yeah, I can see that. Although, like, it is kind of specific. Like, how exactly does one make sure that one is actually a prophet so that you know that this applies to you? And also, can you still die by, like, accidentally falling off a cliff? Like, that's not being killed, that's just dying. Or, like, from, pneumonia or something.
I mean, they did have different words for kill
So,
versus die.
yeah.
So I think there's
So,
some space, some room. There was a tweet that went around the other day that was like, there are a lot of people who are calling themselves prophets. And you know what happened in the Bible? Nobody who was a prophet called themselves a prophet. It's like, kind of
yeah,
makes you think.
I think that's true. Yeah. Yeah, but also, like, I feel like there's space in the world for a morality tale where someone tried to avoid being killed by leaving Jerusalem and wound up, like, dying of a blood infection because they tripped over a campfire or something.
And we're like
And
too far away to get medical attention.
to,
So Jerusalem
yeah,
would have
exactly.
saved them.
Something like
I
that.
like
Yeah.
that.
I feel like that's a fairy tale I would have been told growing up.
That makes
So,
sense. Yeah. And then in verse 34, Jesus continues, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing.
See, Jesus does want to turn into a chicken.
See? Exactly. It's like VeggieTales, but the animal version. Or, alternatively, which vegetable would play the hen and which the fox?
I am not a good person to ask that question because I've only seen a couple of the VeggieTales shorts, but I think that is a perfectly valid question to ask. Yes, and I when I say the VeggieTales shorts, I'm including the really popular songs like "Where Is My
Silly songs
Hairbrush"
with
and the
Larry.
"Pirates Who Don't Do Anything." Yes, so I've seen those. I have not seen the ones that tell the entire Bible stories kind of thing.
Okay. To be fair, those are really complicated, and I think the people that made the VeggieTales are like conservative in ways that I am not okay with.
We would have trouble with.
Yeah. But also, I grew up on VeggieTales, and so.
No, I think it's a perfectly valid question to ask. I'm just not a good person to ask that question to. So I think you should ask our listeners.
Say, what about you, dear listeners? Which vegetable would you associate with Herod the fox, and which vegetable with Jesus the mother hen?
Now I'm wondering what vegetables come back to life.
I mean, for real though, like potatoes can regrow and regrow.
Yeah, that's kind of fair.
Garlic bulbs, garlic. Ooh, garlic.
Mm-hmm. Jesus is garlic. I like that.
Jesus is garlic.
Yeah. And then, before we go a little too off the rails, let's also talk about verse 35, where we read, "See, your house is left to you, and I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Well, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. It does not quite have the same ring to it as "I solemnly swear I am up to no good," but it's still pretty iconic. Yeah. Like, that's the kind of thing that someone isn't just going to say randomly on a Thursday and accidentally cause something extraordinary to happen. So that's probably fair. Unless, of course, they're quoting the Bible. Yeah, that is probably a little different. But maybe we're not, saying it in the correct original language. So who knows?
Truth. Yeah.
Like Gandalf having to say the word for friend in Elvish.
Yeah. And now, the segment you've all been waiting for. Maybe, or maybe not, depending on how much you pay attention.
Or maybe you're about to find out that you were waiting for it without knowing it.
Yes. Our newest segment, thanks to an ongoing conversation that we have been having, but also some Twitter shout-out help from Rabbi Danya Rutenberg, and we will link to the Twitter thread that kind of, well, the couple of Twitter threads that spiraled out of control and inspired it all.
In awesome ways.
In amazing ways, yeah.
Yes.
The segment is called Let's Make a Muppets Musical, because I love alliteration.
Yes.
So this is the time in the episode where we take one of the passages, or we take
a related
passage, and decide if this were turned into a Muppets musical, who would be the token human in the musical? Yes. And or who would definitely, like, which characters would definitely be Muppets and why? Kind of, and which?
And which
Muppets would they be? So my immediate thought in this was, I really want Beaker to be the giant mother hen.
I could totally see that.
Right. But also,
like, when he's not meeping, he is very, nurturing.
Right.
Absolutely.
And like just, well, and the image I have for the mother hen is admittedly from the revised comic lectionary, which we'll also link to, that has like a mother hen like stomping around Jerusalem, kind of Godzilla style.
Yes.
But then I was thinking, isn't there an actual hen in the Muppets?
Yes. So Gonzo has a whole family of chickens that follow him around at various times, but his very favorite is named Camilla, and he loves Camilla, and she shows up in several of the movies, particularly the very first Muppets movie, but also in the others, and he and Camilla are very old friends. So it's very sweet.
Those are my...
Yes, but also earlier in our episode, we talked briefly about the Solomon and the two moms and the baby scene from the Bible. And we also wanted to link to a tweet from at not retro just old on Twitter. That is literally what their username is. Don't at me. But who suggested in our original Twitter thread about casting this Bible musical with Muppets that he wanted Solomon to be played by J.K. Simmons, and then the moms of the scene could be played by Gonzo and the Swedish Chef, and they could be fighting over Camilla. Because, of course, Gonzo wants Camilla to be his best friend, and the Swedish Chef would, want to cook Camilla. And that would make for a great scene, and the fight would be pretty spectacular, I have to think. And there'd be a lot of flying feathers.
That's true. That would be amazing.
Yes,
would
absolutely.
really love that. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the third Sunday of Lent. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, or if you just want to help us keep doing this podcast, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. Also, let us know on Twitter or Facebook who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode. And now, as the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.